John Howard, 25th Prime Minister of Australia from 1996 to 2007, the second longest serving Prime Minister in Australia, who's also had his time as Treasurer from 1977 to 1983. Let's start from the time when you were Treasurer. How's being Treasurer different, or how has it changed from the time that you took over and some of the issues that you were dealing with in liberalizing the Australian economy and the Australian institutions? What's the agenda today as compared to the time when you became Treasurer?
Well, being Treasurer transformed my views as to how the Australian economy should operate. It was an experience which opened my eyes to the need to open up the Australian economy. And the story of Australia over the last 30 years has largely been the story of a number of major reforms that opened up the Australian economy, and both sides of politics made a contribution to those reforms. The Australian economy in the 1970s was still highly protected. We had a managed exchange rate, and we had all sorts of barriers to the free flow of trade. Well, certainly we imposed very heavy burdens, and of course we were subject to very heavy burdens. So the experience taught me the value of a more open economy. And as I look back on that period, particularly from the perspective of our time in government, I'm more than ever convinced that the future lies in maintaining an open trading system and avoiding any reversion to protectionism.
What was the Australian leverage at that point in time that made you comfortable or confident that you'd be able to hold it out and hold the liberal agenda and build on it?
Well, Australia had a modern economy by world standards, but it needed a great deal of reform. What was our leverage? Well, we had for a long time a very strong agricultural sector, but that was largely crippled by the protective barriers imposed by the European Union and also the subsidy policies of the United States and Japan. And we looked therefore to our resource sector, and the 70s and 80s saw the beginnings of what you now see in great abundance. I mean, we discovered iron ore in Australia in the 1960s, and of course we gradually built on all of that. And the mining industry was a valuable industry to Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. Of course, it's an even more valuable industry now.
Well, one of the things that you did in that time was also float the currency.
Well, the dollar was floated by the Labor government, flowing out of a report which I commissioned, and that decision by the Labor government had my very strong support. So what you saw with that float was the opening up of the economy, and that proved to be very valuable to Australia as the years went by.
So I want to connect all of that experience that you have with what some countries need to do today. The Chinese economy, for example, is suffering from massive inflows, a policy of sterilizing those inflows, trying to keep domestic inflation reined in, and yet without a bond market or without a diversified asset base, they are basically the loser in the end. When you look at the developments taking place in China and what they probably need to do, what comes to your mind? What are you thinking?
Well, China has to continue the process of liberalisation. To use that expression, you can't be half pregnant. Once you go down the path of liberalisation, you can't stop halfway. And China has done great things, and the growth of China is not only good for China but is good for the world. But the process of liberalisation has to go on. You can't stop halfway. Now that not only applies to China, it applies to other countries as well.
But the realities that they face, they have a few boundaries that they can't cross because of the way they're structured in that sense. What do you think China should do today?
Well, I think they are issues that China has to face. inevitably have some clash between economic liberalism and political constraint. And one of the interesting adventures of history over the next decades will be to see how China resolves that. I obviously believe in countries having a liberal approach both to politics and to economic management.
And how would you describe that Australia-China relationship today?
Well, the relationship is very good, but it's very pragmatic. It's based on the fact that we have interest in common even though we don't have philosophies in common. And it's important to understand that and not to fret about the fact that we have different philosophies. It's for China to resolve those issues within China. But in the meantime, there's mutual benefit, enormous mutual benefit in the relationship. China is now our major export destination.
How proud are you in terms of your personal relationships with China? And did the government after yours, did they do a better job, do you think? Or were there issues that emanated after you left office that Australia deals with in China today?
Well, I think during my time we developed a very close and pragmatic relationship with China, and we were able simultaneously to grow even closer to the United States at the same time as growing very close to China. I don't want to compare my government with the present government. Both sides of politics in Australia are committed to a good relationship with China. Speaking for myself, we presided over winning the first big sale of LNG to the Guangdong province, which was a real breakthrough in our trade. And of course, our mineral exports, our resource exports, multiplied, something like a 600% increase over a period of years. It was an extraordinary growth.
But interestingly, now that the Chinese corporates are coming the other way and looking at Australian assets to buy, what sort of balance do you think there should be? Or do you think in terms of balance, or do you think in terms of?
Well, you never try and neatly balance a bilateral trade relationship. You achieve overall balance. I mean, the idea that every country has to be in perfect balance with each other. I mean, but we do better in relation to China than many other countries because we have something China needs and needs in great abundance. But of course, we buy a lot of clothing from China, we buy a lot of manufactured goods, we buy a lot of things from China. But it's a beneficial two-way relationship, and Australia is now the most popular destination for Chinese students wishing to study overseas. Now that's a very valuable component of the bilateral relationship.
Let's continue on the theme of liberalisation, and I think Australia's economy is at the point where the government has very little debt. The banks are internationalizing very, very successfully, and corporates are raising debts, international debt, a lot more than they used to. What sort of risks do you think that puts the economy to relative to the global economy?
Well, we're like many other countries, we're subject to the vagaries of the global economy, although we did far better than most when the global financial crisis hit for a number of reasons. We started the crisis with no net debt and a budget surplus, and there was virtually no other country in that situation. And we benefited from the Chinese North Asian connection. Let's not forget our trade relationship with Japan. It's of longer standing than our relationship with China. Perhaps not as strong now as it is with China, but it's still a very valuable part of our overall trade relationship. The other great advantage, as you mentioned, was the strength of our banks. Australian banks didn't suffer the way that European and American banks suffered. And I think there's some wisdom in the argument that the global downturn was more a North Atlantic